All right. Now that we've done this previous video on the creative power of the collective unconscious, and I've defined it as probably the most powerfully creative force in the universe, often mistaken for God or the all or source, we could start delving into various manifestations of the collective unconscious and how they are starting to affect us in our world today. In case you don't know, I'm Egregores, author of Runes for Transformation. I've been doing this Norse mysticism rune things for a long time. And that may be where a lot of people know me from. And throughout my life, the entire life, I've had a paranormal connection working with subtle beings, astral entities, spirits, whatever you want to call them, ancestors, for a very long time. And so I've got a very unique perspective on how the paranormal works, how we interact with it, and how it interacts with us, whether we know it or not, or even want to acknowledge that it's influencing us. And that's a bit about what I want to talk today, is this co-creative potential that we have with the paranormal. I'll start this off by giving one of my little soapbox examples that I keep hearing out there, that we are spiritual beings having a human experience, or we're spiritual beings having a physical experience. And that's simply not true. It's not accurate at all. We are spiritual and physical beings having a dynamic experience. How we affect one part of the world completely affects the other part of the world. What happens in the physical can reflect in the spiritual, and what happens in the spiritual becomes reflected in the physical. And keeping that in mind, when we talk about the collective unconscious, it exists in a place that's not quite the same level as what we would experience as the spiritual. We're still connected at the spiritual, and we're still individuated at the spiritual. And even if we don't have a body, let's say we die and we lose our body, we still have a connection in the afterlife with the collective unconscious. Now, that being said, there are a number of spiritual beings in our reality, in our world, that are not natural born. Well, there's plenty out there. Of course, human beings, dogs, cats, nature spirits. But when it comes to the presence of things like angels and demons and gods and culturally specific beings, like jinn, the good majority of those are actually not natural born. They're created by our own collective unconscious, by our group will, so to speak. A couple of these that we want to talk about today are called Egregores and Tulpas. We can even lump Servitors in there. Servitors are a spiritual being that we create in a ritual setting to go run out and do a specific job for us. They're not sovereign. They're not independent in any way. They just have this one task to perform. They do it, they come back, and we kill it, basically. We end its life because it served its purpose. Tulpas are very much a lot like Servitors. They can be created in a ritual setting for a very specific purpose and for a very specific intention. And like Servitors, they can have a name, they can have a shape, a form, they can have their own existence in that way. But Tulpas tend to be sovereign beings. They can have their own mind, they can have their own sense of sentience and sometimes sapience. They can feel, they can think, they can experience the world, and they can be independent. Thus, Tulpas can be intentionally formed to do more complex jobs. Like a servitor would go find me a book and bring it back. A tulpa would be, let's maintain a library. And tulpas can come from servitors. Let's say a servitor doesn't get killed, doesn't get extinguished, and it continues on its path, but it starts to develop more of a mind and it gets a little bit more complex than what it is. It can become a tulpa. Now, when we look at tulpas and servitors, they need to have a connection with humanity. They need to connect with us emotionally, mentally, energetically so that it will maintain their existence, so they can continue to exist in their own way, doing their own stuff. And they can get wayward. If somebody created them on purpose but didn't extinguish them, didn't kill them, they'll find somebody that has a very similar energy to what they've got. And then they're going to try to promote what they do out in the world. They're going to try to be out in the world and going, oh, great. Like you found the book, but now let's do the library. Oh, you want to be a librarian? So do I. Let's work together on creating this library. So the tulpa can go not necessarily negatively influence somebody, but influence somebody that may have a potential proclivity to be a librarian and put together books, and they may not. The other kind of being that we're going to talk about are egregores. These come from our collective beliefs. When we tell the same stories over and over and over about a certain type of being that has a certain characteristic, that has a certain look, that needs certain things from us, our continued collective belief will bring these egregores to life. They can be sovereign, sentient, sapient beings, just like tulpas. But because they're more tapped into a collective, a tulpa and a servitor are more individuated. But an egregore is collective. And because they are part of the collective mindset and the collective grouping, they tend to affect bigger swaths of the populace with what they're doing. And they can have immense power. This is why people will see them as angels and demons and gods, because they can affect so much. They can really connect with our own creative potential in the collective unconscious. They can affect their own will into the world because they are sovereign beings. And they operate on a different level of existence than most people can perceive. The real danger of egregores and tulpas comes from people who are unaware of their influence. People that don't acknowledge the existence of such things. They are incapable of perceiving information from them, let alone knowing that they're being influenced by them. And these things will influence people emotionally, logically. They'll influence their belief patterns. And sometimes they can come in somewhat familiar forms. Let's say reptilian form. Because humanity has, like it or not, a history of reviling reptilian type things, snakes, serpents, lizards, all those kind of things. There tends to be a collective culture of relegating reptiles to this very primal, if not evil, state where they just feed and fight and feed and fight and feed and fight. And now when we look at corrupt power leaders, we tend to see that reptilian influence in them. We can see that their reptilian part of their brains are going. They just want to feed themselves their greed. And they're going to fight to keep that. So they are corrupt. They're starting wars. They are doing awful things to other people to hold their position of power. And collectively, we look at that and have looked at that for millennia, not just decades or centuries, but for millennia as reptilian beings. Like maybe they come from another dimension, maybe they come from another planet, and they're influencing our leaders, our rulers. So no wonder they're corrupt and they're evil. And that long-term collective belief in these things brings them to life in their own way. So reptilian beings are real. They're out in the world, but they're not real. They're not like aliens. Well, I don't know. I can't say this for a fact. They're not like aliens coming from a spaceship, walking down a ramp and pointing a gun to a president's head and say, do this, do that, do this, do that. It's more like they have a subtle influence like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if you did this thing and you'll get some more money, you'll get some more power, some more fame and notoriety for it? Oh, now that you did that, how about you do this? I bet that's going to be easy because it's going to get you more money and fame and power. Oh, you did that. How about this? And next thing you know, these people under the influence of egregores and tulpas are going down a slippery slope that they didn't expect to be going down. And maybe they were corrupt, maybe they weren't, but because they were listening to this influence, not realizing the source of the influence, they're going down a path that's just dark and awful and affecting so many people. And because it's affecting so many people, those egregores and tulpas are getting fed exactly what they need. Now, this exemplifies why it's so important to build your paranormal awareness. Because there are so many of these beings out there, there's so many different types, and I'm not going to say there's a devil lurking around the corner ready to tempt you into sin. No, I'm saying these beings are out there exerting their subtle influences on us so that we enact their will instead of our will. And if you are unaware of their influence and how they work, then you're under their influence. You can't break free because you don't know if you need to break free. You don't know how they're communicating. You don't know what they're communicating, and you don't know what the implications of that are. So if you can work on building your awareness to these subtle beings, their subtle forms of communication, their methods of manipulation, then you can actually have power over your own mind and say, nope, that wasn't my thought, that wasn't my emotion, that wasn't my intention. I'm not doing that because that's not me. That's not in alignment with who I am and what my purpose is. So I'm cutting that out of my life, and I'm going to go live my life in my own way. And then another time you'll hear that subtle influence, hey, do this, do that. Maybe it is in alignment. And you can sit there and say, oh, cool, whoever you are, thank you for that. Without paranormal awareness, without building those avenues of understanding, without being able to open your mind and your consciousness to receive this information, you're just a sitting target. I don't mean to amp up the fear factor or the scare factor here. It's just kind of a fact of paranormal reality. And I will still hold that 90+% of everything in the paranormal realms is actually positive. It's very great. It's really wonderful. But it's that less than 10% that if you're not aware of the influence, if you're not aware of the subtle whispers, is not really necessarily working in your best favor. Because, I mean, come on, look at the history of humanity. It hasn't really been that great. It's getting better. I will hold that. I'm being an optimist about humanity. It's getting better. But we've got millennia of crap to sort through and heal from. And those millennia of crap have produced some pretty icky entities that still want to exist, that still want to have their influence felt on the world. And they're just looking for a mind, a subtle being to exert their influence over so that they get their fix, they get their feed. Because that's all they really want. I'm not saying they're evil. I'm not saying they're bad. In some ways, they've been really beneficial for the growth of humanity. But what's really essential for the growth of humanity right now is that you learn to develop your paranormal skills. You learn to open your mind to the subtle world all around you, to understand its influence on you, so that you can take back your mind, your world, and your life, and no longer be under the influence of these unseen forces. And in other videos, we're going to go over how these beings influence us and what they do to us and make it work with us, and then how we can avoid it. So this is just kind of an intro to it, but we needed also that knowledge of the collective unconscious to see how these beings come into existence. Now we're going to talk about their influence and how to avoid that influence. So I look forward to seeing you in further videos coming down the line. Leave me some comments. Let me know some questions or thoughts that are going through your mind. And until next time, hail.